The lights of the San Francisco Tech Expo that year blazed like an artificial sky. On stage, Glenn Martin, the man the entire U.S. tech world called the billion-dollar brain, stood in a forest of cameras, his smile cold yet perfectly programmed. He wore a gray Tom Ford suit, a Patek Philippe watch glittering on his wrist, and his voice cut through the excited air like a blade as it echoed from the microphone. We're not just creating technology. We're redefining the safety of the digital world. Hundreds rose to applaud. Investors, journalists, and the most powerful faces of Silicon Valley crowded forward. But just as the screen behind Glenn lit up with the words, "Martin Cybertech, the future of protection," his vision began to blur. The world around him smeared at the edges, the cheering warped into a strange echoing sound, as if rising from the bottom of a well. Glenn blinked, his hand trembling, and barely managed to grip the edge of the podium before his body collapsed onto the stage. Shouts erupted. Cameras swiveled to capture the moment the icon of American technology fell in the very glow he had built for himself. A reporter screamed, "Someone call 911." For a few seconds, the whole world seemed to stop. UCSF Hospital, 3 a.m. The ER doors burst open, cold white light spilling across the corridor. Dr. Phillips emerged, his face heavy. Glenn still lay motionless on the bed, his hand stiff like cooled metal. "Stage 4, pancreatic cancer," the doctor said tersely. "No further treatment options. With luck, he has 6 months." Glenn's assistant choked out. "But he's only 38. "Death doesn't care about age," the doctor replied, closing the file. Inside the empty room, Glenn opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling. The same cold white ceiling he'd seen dozens of times in tech surgeries. But this time, it was real. The monitor beeped steadily, each pulse a countdown to the end. He gave a dry, cracked laugh. "I built technology that can block every hacker on Earth. But it can't hack fate." A week later, Chicago. The plane landed amid a heavy snowstorm. Glenn sat in the back of a black Bentley, watching the city lights smear across the river's surface. The city where he had built his empire now felt as cold as a vast graveyard. His penthouse occupied the 80th floor of Trump Tower, gleaming emotionless absolute. Marble floors, massive glass panes reflecting the snowy sky. An apartment designed to leave no room for the human self, only power and silence. As the automatic doors slid open, the only person waiting was a young woman in a black uniform. "Welcome back, Mr. Martin," Naomi said softly. Her voice was warm and steady, not trembling like the other staff. Glenn nodded. He didn't reply, just walked straight to his office. But before the door closed, he stopped and asked absently, "How long have you worked here?" 4 months, sir." "Where are you from?" "New Orleans. I studied nursing but had to drop out to care for my grandmother." He was silent, then murmured, "I understand." Naomi bowed her head, unaware that this moment, this exchange was the beginning of a chain of tragedies neither of them would ever forget. Night. Chicago lay buried under snow. Glenn sat before the massive window overlooking the Michigan River, where the lights trembled like shattered memories. On the table lay medical papers stamped in stark print. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He poured himself a drink, burning his throat, as if trying to erase the sensation of rotting from the inside. Everything he'd once had, the billion-dollar company, the awards, the praise, the sycophants, meant nothing now. Death would not remember his name. He opened his laptop and played an old recording. A woman's voice filled the room, warm but distant. "You can't love anyone else if you still hate yourself." "Glenn?" He stopped it immediately. It was the voice of his ex, the one who betrayed him, selling his secrets to a rival. Since that day, he had trusted no one, believed in no love, and even less in kindness. But when he turned, he saw Naomi quietly clearing the table behind him, her every movement careful, as though afraid of wounding the air. He asked abruptly, "You're not afraid of me?" Naomi paused, then smiled. "No, sir. I'm only afraid of people dying before anyone ever truly cares about them." Her words struck Glenn silent. It had been a long time since anyone had said something kind to him without an agenda. He watched her small yet proud figure disappear from the room, a streak of light in his gray world. The next morning, Glenn arrived at the company. Martin's cybertech buzzed with rumors of the CEO's illness. The media swarmed, stocks fell. The board whispered about succession. A trusted employee asked, "Shall I schedule another specialist appointment?" Glenn gave a faint smile. "No. What I need is to schedule my funeral." He left the office and returned to his penthouse. When the elevator opened, Naomi was arranging pale yellow tulips in the hallway flowers, in sharp contrast to the house's cold palette. She looked up, their eyes meeting. For a heartbeat, Glenn felt he was staring at something he'd forgotten, a soul still whole. He asked, "Why yellow flowers?" "Because they're like sunlight," she replied. "Even in winter, people need to remember light exists." Glenn said nothing, simply stood watching her for a long moment. In the dim glow, his face and her silhouette reflected together on the glass, two people of different worlds and different skin, caught in a single frame. That night he didn't sleep. In the quiet room, a reckless thought began to take shape at once, wrong and desperate. If he couldn't live, at least he could leave a part of himself behind. Another life breathing when he no longer could. He knew the idea was foolish, almost deranged, but to someone who had already counted his remaining days, the most insane thing might be the only thing that made him feel alive. And as the first morning light shone through the window, glinting off Naomi's face as she walked down the hall, Glenn knew she was the one who would change his fate. From somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "If I have only 6 months, I'll live, so the world won't forget me." He didn't know it yet, but that decision would lead him to the most devastating and the most beautiful chapter of his life. Because sometimes the beginning of love is not when two people meet, but when one of them knows they're about to disappear. The wind outside the Trump Tower howled against the glass, streaking the windows with cold rain, as if the city itself was mourning something unseen. Inside the penthouse, Glenn Martin sat in silence, a tumbler of whiskey untouched beside him. The fire flickered weakly in the hearth, its glow throwing fleeting shadows across his face, strong, defined, yet hollowed by something that had no shape, but carried the weight of inevitability. He'd spent hours trying to reason with the thought that had taken root in his mind since dawn. It was irrational, even grotesque. And yet the more he pushed it away, the more it tightened its hold, like a storm cloud, refusing to move until it broke. When Naomi entered the room, the sound of her footsteps was soft against the marble floor, almost reverent. She carried a tray of tea, the delicate scent of chamomile drifting through the air. Glenn turned his head slightly, studying her, as though she were a question he couldn't yet answer. Her presence had become a strange comfort in the chaos of his unraveling world. There was something disarmingly calm about her, an honesty that stripped away all pretense. "You're awake early, Mr. Martin," she said gently, setting the cup beside him. "I couldn't sleep," he replied, his voice lower than usual, roughened by something between exhaustion and thought. Naomi hesitated, watching the untouched glass beside him. "Whiskey at 6 a.m. isn't sleep's friend either." He allowed a faint smile to flicker across his lips. Rare, fleeting. Neither is the truth. She tilted her head slightly. What truth is that? That I'm running out of time. Her brow furrowed. You mean deadlines again? Glenn shook his head slowly. No. Time. He looked at her eyes, clear and unwavering now. I'm dying, Naomi. 6 months, maybe less. The words fell into the room like glass, shattering in slow motion. Naomi froze her breath, catching audibly in her throat. For a moment she thought he might be joking, testing her reaction. But there was no cruelty in his tone, only the cold finality of someone who had already made peace with hell. I don't understand, she whispered. You don't have to, he said quietly. It's pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. I've seen the scans, the numbers, the predictions. It's all math now. Naomi's eyes glistened. Is there no treatment? No chance. There's always treatment, he said with a bitter laugh. But not for the kind of emptiness that comes after you've spent your whole life building something, only to realize no one will remember you when you're gone. Silence pressed between them. The fire hissed softly. Finally, she found her voice again. You've built something incredible, Mr. Martin. People admire you. He cut her off, his tone sharp, but weary. Admiration dies with the man. A company changes logos. New hands take over, and everything I've ever done becomes a footnote. Naomi looked at him, her eyes deep and tender, filled with something he hadn't seen in years. Empathy without pity. You're wrong, she said softly. People don't remember what you built. They remember what you leave behind. The words struck him deeper than she knew. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. That's the problem, Naomi. I have nothing to leave behind. She didn't reply, only stood there, her hands folded in front of her apron, waiting as though she sensed he wasn't finished. And he wasn't. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if I told you I wanted to change that? She blinked, confused. Change what? The fact that when I die, there will be nothing left of me that truly lives. Her confusion deepened, but before she could respond, he rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. He took a few steps closer, his gaze fixed on hers, steady, searching, vulnerable. I've made a decision, he said, and I need you to listen before you judge me. Something in his tone made her heart tighten. I'm listening, she said quietly. I want a child, he said simply. For a moment, Naomi thought she had misheard him. The air seemed to thin. Her pulse quickened. A child. He nodded once. My blood, my name, something that carries me forward when I'm gone. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. It was as though her mind was racing to catch up with what her heart already knew. It wasn't a metaphor. He meant it literally. I want you to carry it, he said. Finally, his eyes locked on hers, unflinching. The world tilted. Naomi took a step back, her hand instinctively rising to her chest. Mr. Martin, that's unthinkable. He finished for her, his voice raw. Yes, I know. Believe me, I've thought about that. But I've also thought about the fact that there's no one else. No one I trust. No one who would understand what this means. Her breath came shallow. You barely know me. I know enough, he said quietly. I know you're kind. I know you've seen pain and didn't let it make you cruel. I know you'd never do something for money, but for meaning. Her eyes filled with disbelief and something else, something like sorrow. You can't ask me this, she whispered. I'm not asking for love, Naomi, he said, his tone softening. I'm asking for trust. for one act of grace before I disappear." She shook her head slowly, tears threatening to fall. "You think this is grace? You think it's mercy to ask someone to—" Her voice broke. "To bear a child for a man who won't even be here to hold it." Glenn's eyes darkened, but there was no anger in them, only quiet desperation. "I think it's the only way I'll ever feel human again." The honesty in his voice was devastating. It stripped him bare. No arrogance, no control. Just a man facing the edge of his own mortality and reaching out for something, anything that still felt real. Naomi pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out the sound of the rain outside. Every instinct told her to leave, to run from this madness. But something, some fragile thread of compassion, rooted her to the floor. "Please," he said softly, almost pleading. "Don't answer now. Just think about it." She turned away, blinking hard to keep from crying. "I don't know if I can." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But maybe that's what makes it honest." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire burned low. Naomi gathered the courage to lift her gaze again, and in that moment, she saw him differently, not as a billionaire, not as her employer, but as a man already half gone, holding on to the last thread of meaning left to him. When she finally left the study, her legs felt weak. Upstairs in her small room, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the rain streaking down the windowpane. The sound was steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Her thoughts spiraled images of her grandmother's hands, of the patients she once cared for in the nursing program she could no longer afford, of the loneliness that came with watching someone you love fade away. And now this man, this impossibly distant, broken man, was asking her to help him cheat death in the only way he could imagine. It was madness, and yet, somewhere beneath her fear, something stirred. A memory of the way he'd looked at her, not with desire, but with the kind of ache that came from knowing you had no more time to waste. She buried her face in her hands and whispered into the dark, "God, what am I supposed to do downstairs?" Glenn sat alone in the study, the same untouched whiskey still glinting under the firelight. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, pale and sharp-edged. He had expected her to laugh, to refuse outright. But the way she had looked at him, torn, conflicted, human, had given him something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of hope. As the clock struck midnight, he leaned back in his chair and whispered into the empty room, "If she says no, I'll accept it. But if she says yes—" He paused, his voice breaking. "Then maybe something in me can live after all." Upstairs, Naomi lay awake, her eyes open wide in the darkness, every breath a battle between fear and compassion. She didn't yet know that the choice she would make in the coming days would alter not just his fate, but her own forever. That in giving life, she would find hers changed in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Naomi didn't sleep that night. The sound of rain against the glass became her only witness, soft and relentless like the pulse of something she couldn't quiet inside herself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the way Glenn had looked at her with those gray eyes that carried both power and despair. The kind of gaze that came from someone who had stopped believing in miracles, yet still secretly begged for one. By dawn, her hands were cold. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the faint glow of Chicago's skyline. Her thoughts tangled between fear, disbelief, and something she didn't want to name. The proposal had sounded absurd, almost indecent when he first said it. But what unsettled her most wasn't the request, it was the sincerity behind it. Glenn hadn't spoken as a man seeking possession. He had spoken as someone asking for absolution. When Naomi finally rose, The house was still. The silence felt heavier than usual, as if even the walls were holding their breath. She walked down the long hallway, her bare feet soundless on the marble floor. She hesitated in front of the study door. Through the thin crack, she saw him sitting exactly where she'd left him, the night before the fire burned low, the whiskey glass still untouched. He looked older somehow, as though the night had taken something more from him. She didn't enter. Not yet. Instead, she slipped quietly toward the kitchen, the rhythm of familiar tasks grounding her boiling water, slicing bread, arranging fruit. It was easier to move than to think. But her thoughts wouldn't leave her alone. They circled back to his words. "I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for trust." Trust. The word hurt more than it should have. By mid-morning, Glenn emerged from the study. He looked as though he hadn't slept either, but his composure remained intact, his movements deliberate, precise. He found her in the kitchen, arranging the breakfast tray. "Naomi," he said quietly. She froze for a heartbeat, then turned. "Good morning, Mr. Martin." He studied her face. There was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet strength that both comforted and unnerved him. "You didn't sleep." "No," she admitted. "Neither did you." He gave a faint nod. "I didn't expect you to answer right away. I just needed you to know what I was asking wasn't out of selfishness." Her hands tightened on the tray. "It's not something you can ask without changing everything, Mr. Martin." "I know." His voice broke slightly, a tremor beneath the calm. "But I meant what I said. I don't want to die with nothing but numbers in my legacy. I've spent years building a fortress around myself, and now that it's all falling apart, I realize I never let anything real in." She wanted to look away, but his honesty pinned her where she stood. "You've built something that protects millions," she said softly. "That's not nothing." He smiled bitterly. "It's everything, and it means nothing. I made the world safer, but I never learned how to make a home." The quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, reverent, like standing on the edge of something vast. Naomi took a slow breath. "What you're asking of me," she began, "isn't just about a child. It's about faith. And I've already lost so much. I'm not sure I have any left to give." He stepped closer, not intrusively, but enough for her to see the exhaustion written in every line of his face. "Then take mine," he said softly. "What's left of it, at least." Her throat tightened. He wasn't begging. He wasn't manipulating. He was simply offering her the last piece of himself. That night, the storm returned. The city lights shimmered like broken glass through the rain, as Naomi sat alone in her room again, holding her grandmother's old cross in her palm. It was the only thing she had left from New Orleans, from a time when she still believed life was something she could plan. Her grandmother used to say, "God doesn't always give you choices you understand, but He gives you the ones that change you." Maybe this was that kind of choice. When the clock struck midnight, she rose. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled on a robe and made her way down the hall. Every step echoed louder than it should have, like a countdown. She stopped outside his study door, her breath shallow. Then, without knocking, she entered. Glenn looked up from his desk. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The moment stretched between them, tense, fragile, sacred. "I've thought about what you said," she whispered. He nodded slowly, and her eyes glistened, but her voice stayed steady. "I'll do it. Not for money, not out of pity, but because maybe what you're asking isn't about death. Maybe it's about leaving something that proves you were more than what the world saw." For the first time in months, he exhaled a sound that was almost a sob. He rose from his chair, unsure whether to thank her or fall apart. "Naomi, I don't," she said gently. Don't thank me. Just promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me this won't just be about your ending, but about my beginning too." He looked at her for a long time, something like reverence flickering in his eyes. "Then, I promise." The hours that followed didn't feel like a transaction or even a farewell. They felt like confession. When he reached for her, it wasn't with urgency, but with awe, like a man afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. Naomi's breath trembled as his fingers brushed her cheek. There was no pretense, no hunger, only two people standing at the edge of something irreversible. When he leaned in, his lips were soft, uncertain, reverent. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Neither do I," he murmured, resting his forehead against hers. "But maybe that's the point." The world outside faded, the rain, the thunder, the city that had forgotten how to feel. All that remained was the warmth of skin against skin, the sound of their breathing, and the unspoken understanding that this was not an act of lust, but of surrender. He touched her like a man trying to memorize what it meant to be alive. She held him like someone forgiving a stranger she was only beginning to know. When it was over, they lay in the dim light, her head resting against his chest. His heart was unsteady beneath her ear, but it was the most human sound she'd ever heard. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't answer. Words felt too small for what had just happened. Later, when she returned to her room, Naomi sat by the window again, watching the rain trace long, trembling lines down the glass. She didn't cry. She only closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she wasn't sure how to finish. Downstairs, Glenn sat in silence. The fire had burned to embers. He didn't feel redeemed, not yet, but for the first time in years, he felt seen. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows for the first time in weeks. Naomi moved quietly through the house, her hands steady, even though her heart wasn't. Glenn was already awake, standing by the window in his robe, the city spread out below him, like an empire he no longer ruled. When she brought him coffee, he turned to her, and for the briefest second his eyes softened. "You should take the day off," he said. "I'm fine. I insist." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." As she left the room, Glenn turned back to the glass. His reflection stared back, haunted but alive. Somewhere deep in his chest, something fragile stirred a quiet, dangerous thing he had almost forgotten the name of. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and soundless, blanketing the edges of the Chicago skyline in white. From the penthouse windows, the city looked peaceful, almost forgiving, though inside time was running out. Glenn Martin stood by the glass, his reflection ghosted over the world he once ruled. He could see his own breath fogging the window, the proof that for now, he was still here. Naomi entered quietly, carrying a tray with tea and his medication. She had started doing that every morning. No one asked her to, but it had become part of the rhythm of the house. Her presence was steady grounding, a warmth that softened the cold sterility of his days. Glenn turned as she approached, his gray eyes meeting hers with a faint, weary smile. "Morning," he murmured. "Morning," she replied, placing the tray on the table. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" "I'm afraid sleep and I have become strangers," he said lightly, though the rasp in his voice betrayed his fatigue. Naomi didn't press. She poured the tea, her movements calm and deliberate, and handed him the cup. When his fingers brushed hers, she felt the tremor there, subtle but unmistakable. His strength was fading faster than either of them had expected. He took a sip, exhaled slowly, then looked at her with something searching in his gaze. "Do you ever wonder?" He began, "What people will remember when we're gone." Naomi blinked. "I don't think about it much. You should." he said not unkindly. Because in the end, memory is all we leave behind, and it's fragile. Too fragile. She studied him, her heart tightening. Maybe it's not about being remembered, Mr. Martin. Maybe it's about what we give while we're still here. Her words lingered in the air, delicate, but unshakable. Glenn lowered his gaze, a faint smile touching his lips. You always manage to make the impossible sound simple. It's not simple, she said softly. It's just human. For a moment he didn't respond. Then he reached out, brushing his thumb over her wrist, the gesture so light, it felt like a question rather than a touch. You make me wish I'd learned to be that sooner. She didn't know how to answer, so she stayed silent. The truth was, she was beginning to wish for things too. Things she shouldn't, things that scared her. Because in the quiet between them, something unspoken had begun to take root, and she didn't know how to stop it. Days passed, then weeks. The winter deepened, and with it, Glenn's illness. Some mornings he woke with fire in his eyes, defying the frailty that crept into his body. Other days he could barely rise from bed, his breath shallow, his hands cold. Naomi stayed close through it all, reading to him when he couldn't focus, helping him dress, when his fingers failed him, keeping the house alive with small, simple rituals that gave shape to the days. He had begun to talk more in fragments and memories about his childhood in upstate New York, about the brother he hadn't spoken to in 10 years, about the mistakes that built the empire now crumbling beneath him. Naomi listened quietly, not as a servant, but as someone who understood what regret could do to a person's soul. One evening as the fire burned low and snow tapped softly against the windows, Glenn turned to her suddenly. Do you regret it? She looked up from the book in her lap. Regret what? What we did that night. The question caught her off guard. She set the book down, fingers lingering on the worn edges of the page. No, she said finally. Do you? He hesitated, his throat working before he spoke. No, he whispered, but sometimes I wish I'd met you sooner, before I built all these walls. She smiled faintly. Maybe you had to build them first, so I'd have something to walk through. He laughed softly, the sound low and tired, but real. It had been so long since laughter had sounded natural between them. That night, Naomi lingered a little longer by his bedside, watching as his breathing steadied into sleep. She should have left, but instead she found herself reaching out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He stirred, but didn't wake, and for the first time she let herself acknowledge it, the quiet ache blooming in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something tender and alive, something that frightened her with its intensity. The following week, the doctor returned with more test results. The news was quiet, merciless. The cancer had spread to his liver. Glenn listened without reaction, his face unreadable, his voice calm. But when the doctor left, Naomi saw it, the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes lingered on the horizon, as if trying to memorize it. Later that night, he called her to the study. The room was dim, filled with the scent of oak and smoke. On the desk sat a stack of papers neatly arranged beside a sealed envelope. What is this? She asked. My will, he said simply. I've finalized it. Naomi's breath caught. Glenn. He raised a hand gently. It's all right. I want you to know I've made provisions for you. I don't want your money, she said quickly, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his expression soft. I know. That's why you'll get it anyway. She tried to speak, but emotion choked her. He took a slow step toward her, his hand finding hers. This isn't charity, Naomi. This is acknowledgement. You've done more for me than anyone in my life ever did." Her eyes filled. "Please don't talk like you're already gone." "I'm not," he said. "Not yet." His thumb brushed her knuckles, and for a moment it felt like time itself held still. "But I need to know that when I am something of me, we'll still be here." She squeezed his hand, tears finally breaking free. "You already are." He smiled faintly, that quiet, heartbreaking smile of a man who finally believed someone meant it. In the days that followed, he grew weaker. His steps slowed. His voice softened, but there was a peace to him now, a stillness that hadn't existed before. Naomi noticed it when she helped him walk to the balcony one afternoon. The snow had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in silver light. "Do you believe in signs?" he asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "Sometimes," she said. "Why?" He pointed toward the horizon, where the sun was breaking through the clouds, gold spilling over the frozen lake. "That looks like a sign to me, a reminder that even winter ends." Naomi felt her throat tighten. "Then we'll wait for spring," she whispered. He turned to her eyes, gleaming faintly. "Promise me you'll see it, even if I can't. I promise." That evening, when she tucked him into bed, he caught her wrist gently. "Naomi," he murmured, his voice almost gone. "If there's a next life, I hope I meet you first." She pressed his hand to her lips. "Then I'll find you," she whispered, "wherever that is." 2 mornings later, she found him in the study, slumped slightly in the chair by the window, the light of dawn spilling over him. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, as though he'd simply drifted into sleep. For a long time, she stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. When she finally crossed the room and touched his hand, it was cool beneath her fingers. And then the tears came, not in violent sobs, but in quiet waves that shook her whole body. The funeral was small, private. Executives, lawyers, distant relatives, all faces of formality, all speaking of legacy and empire. None of them spoke of the man. Naomi stood at the back, dressed in black, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even him. But as the priest spoke the final words, a single tear slipped down her cheek, and she whispered to the wind, "He'll know." Because somewhere beyond the cold ground and marble tomb, Glenn Martin would live again in the heartbeat she carried within her. And for the first time in her life, Naomi realized that grief and love were not opposites. They were mirrors. One could not exist without the other. The first days after Glenn's death passed like a fever dream. The penthouse once echoing with the quiet hum of machines, and his restless pacing now lay in solemn stillness. The city outside went on sirens, wind life, but within those high glass walls, Naomi moved like a ghost through a mausoleum of memories. Every surface still bore his presence, the half-read books by his bedside, the faint trace of cologne on his robe, the papers left neatly arranged on the mahogany desk. He had always been meticulous, even in dying. She tried to pack her things, but every drawer seemed to open another wound. A cufflink, a handwritten note, the mug he never finished his coffee from. She would stand for long moments just staring, unable to tell whether she was mourning him or the quiet he had left behind. By the end of the week, the lawyers came, men in dark suits who spoke in measured tones about liquidation, asset redistribution, and executive transition. Words that reduced a man's life to paperwork. She signed forms, nodded when expected, and kept her voice steady. It wasn't until they informed her she had 2 weeks to vacate the penthouse that the walls finally began to feel like what they were, someone else's world. That night, the city glowed beneath her like a constellation she no longer belonged to. She sat by the window, hands resting on her abdomen, the realization settling in like the softest, most terrifying truth. She hadn't missed her period in weeks. The nausea, the aching tenderness, she'd ignored the signs. But now, there was no denying it. "Glenn," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "You did leave something behind." The tears came quietly, not as grief, but as something more complicated, a strange fusion of fear, love, and purpose. In that single moment, the void inside her shifted. The silence of the penthouse wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered, no return address. The envelope was embossed with a name she barely recognized, Richard Hale. Glenn had mentioned him once in a passing story about loyalty and betrayal, the kind of story a man tells when he's testing if someone still believes in friendship. Naomi hesitated before opening it. The note inside was brief, written in a precise, almost old-fashioned hand. "Ms. Carter, my name is Richard Hale. I was Glenn's attorney and friend. He trusted me with certain private matters that concern you. Please meet me at the Blackstone Cafe on Dearborn tomorrow at 2 o'clock. R.H." For a long time, she just stared at the signature, her mind torn between suspicion and hope. Then, folding the letter carefully, she whispered to herself, "All right, Mr. Hale, let's see what you know." The next afternoon, the sky hung heavy with snow clouds. The cafe was quiet. Its windows fogged the smell of roasted coffee and rain-soaked wool, thick in the air. Richard Hale was already there when she arrived, tall, broad-shouldered, with silvering hair and eyes that carried the calm authority of someone used to holding secrets. "Ms. Carter," he greeted, rising as she approached. "Thank you for coming." "Naomi," she said softly, shaking his hand. "You knew Glenn since before Martin Cybertech was more than a dream," he replied. His voice was low, steady. "We started as partners, then friends, before life made us both different kinds of men." He gestured for her to sit. When she did, he studied her quietly for a moment, his gaze kind but analytical. "He told me about you." Her pulse quickened. "He did?" "Yes. Not much, but enough to know you mattered." Naomi looked down, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "He didn't have time to tell me much before." She couldn't finish. Richard nodded, his expression softening. He knew he wouldn't. That's why he left this. He slid a thick envelope across the table. Inside, neatly folded, were legal documents, a notarized will trust agreements, and at the top, Glenn's signature. Naomi's breath caught when she saw her name written in ink beside the line that read, "Primary Guardian." "He meant for you to see this after the funeral," Richard explained. He didn't want the board or his family to interfere before it was legally binding. Her throat tightened. "Guardian of what?" "Of his heir," Richard said gently. Her hand flew instinctively to her stomach. He noticed his expression, confirming what she already knew he'd guessed. "So it's true," he murmured. "He must have known." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never told him. I didn't even know myself until after he..." Richard leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Then consider this, his final act of faith. He set up a private trust in your name, modest but secure. Enough for you and the child. But there's more." He pulled out another sealed envelope, this one smaller. "He wrote you something. I don't know what it says. I promised him I wouldn't open it." Naomi stared at it for a long moment before taking it. Her hands trembled as she traced the familiar handwriting across the front, for Naomi. "When I'm gone." The cafe seemed to blur around her. She whispered, Why are you helping me? Richard's expression shifted, a flicker of something personal passing through it. Because Glenn was my friend. Because he saved me once in a way I never repaid. And because I think he finally found peace with you. That deserves to be protected. Naomi looked up at him, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Thank you. He shook his head. Don't thank me yet. His family won't take this quietly. The Martins will want control. The board will want silence. They'll try to erase you. You need someone to stand beside you. Her voice was barely a whisper. Will you? Yes, he said simply. If you'll let me. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like steadiness return, a flicker of light through the fog. That night, in the small apartment she'd rented after leaving the penthouse, Naomi opened Glenn's letter. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and ink. His handwriting was sharp, deliberate. Naomi, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I don't have words for what you gave me, but I need you to know that in the end, it wasn't despair that followed me. It was you. You made me remember what it means to be human. If there's a child, tell them I was proud, long before I ever saw them. Tell them they were born not out of fear of dying, but out of the hope of being remembered in the right way. And tell them their mother is the bravest person I ever knew. Glenn. She read it again and again until the tears blurred the ink. Then she pressed the letter to her chest, whispering, You're not forgotten. Weeks turned into months. Her belly began to swell, her steps slower, her world smaller. But she wasn't alone. Richard visited often, sometimes to discuss legal matters, sometimes just to bring food and warmth. He never overstepped, never pitied. His kindness was the kind that waited, quiet and patient, like a man who understood grief too well to rush it. One evening, as spring thawed the last of the snow, he found her sitting by the river. The wind carried the faint scent of lilacs, the same kind Glenn used to keep in his study. You're strong, Richard said softly, sitting beside her. I'm trying, she replied. You're doing more than that. He looked out at the water, his voice thoughtful. Glenn would have liked this place. He hated noise, said peace was too expensive in his world. She smiled faintly. He'd have found a way to buy it anyway. Richard chuckled under his breath. He would. Then his tone softened. But maybe he finally learned that peace isn't bought. It's given. Naomi looked down at her stomach, resting her hand gently there. He gave me this, she said. A reason to keep living. Richard turned to her, his eyes kind. Then let me help you protect it. When she met his gaze, she saw no ulterior motive, no pity, only a quiet understanding, the kind born from loss and loyalty alike. And in that moment, beneath the soft evening light, Naomi realized something. Legacy wasn't only what Glenn had left behind, it was what she was building now. Not an empire, not wealth, but a story, a continuation. And for the first time since that night in the storm, she didn't feel like she was carrying death. She was carrying life. The courthouse loomed over Dearborn Street, like a monument to judgment, tall, cold, and unyielding. The morning air was heavy with the scent of wet stone and spring rain. Naomi stood at the steps, her coat drawn tightly around her small but growing frame, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Her other hand clutched the folder Richard had prepared for her, a lifetime, compressed into documents, signatures, and truths that too many people were determined to erase. Inside, the corridors buzzed with the sound of heels and whispers. Lawyers in tailored suits moved like clockwork through the halls, faces carved with detachment. Naomi followed Richard's steady stride, her pulse quickening with every step. The courtroom ahead, felt less like a place of justice and more like an arena, a place where truth would bleed before it was believed. When they entered, the opposing side was already there, the Martin family and the board members of Cybertech. They sat in perfect alignment, faces, pale, expensive, and contemptuous. At their center, Glenn's brother Charles Martin leaned back in his chair with a practiced smirk. He was everything Glenn had despised: ambition without empathy, wealth without restraint. Naomi lowered her gaze, her breath unsteady. Richard leaned toward her, his voice low but firm. "Don't look at them. Look at me when you need to. You have nothing to prove to their arrogance." She nodded faintly, clutching the file tighter. When the judge entered, a silver-haired woman with clear, discerning eyes, the room fell into silence. The hearing began. The lawyers for the Martin family spoke first, their words sharp as scalpels. They painted Naomi as a fabrication, an opportunist, a woman who had seduced a dying man for inheritance, a maid who had mistaken sympathy for love. Their arguments were polished venom wrapped in velvet. "She has no legal claim," one of them declared. "No marriage, no public acknowledgement, and no evidence of paternal intent. The alleged child remains unverified." Naomi's fingers dug into the folder, her knuckles whitening. Every word scraped against her, each sentence, erasing pieces of the man she'd known. The man who'd whispered to her under a sky full of snow that legacy wasn't about wealth, but about love that endures. Richard rose slowly when their voices died down. His presence carried weight, not loud, not theatrical, but deliberate. He didn't pace or shout. He simply looked at the judge and began to speak as if telling a story he knew by heart. Glenn Martin was not a perfect man, he said, but he was a man who in his final months sought redemption. He didn't leave this world chasing profit or power. He left trying to hold on to something human, and that something was Naomi Carter. Murmurs rippled through the room, but Richard continued, his voice calm and steady. "I was his attorney and friend for nearly 15 years. I watched him build an empire out of nothing, and I watched him lose faith in everything until her. In the last weeks of his life, he changed his will, his trusts, his intentions, not out of weakness, but clarity." He placed a sealed envelope on the evidence table. This was retrieved from Mr. Martin's private safe, signed, notarized, and witnessed. In it, he named Ms. Carter as the primary guardian of his heir, his child, whom she now carries. The room erupted in whispers. Charles Martin leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "We'll contest that signature. This is absurd. She's just a careful," Richard cut, in his tone suddenly sharp enough to draw blood. "That word has already destroyed one man in your family. Don't make it two." Even the judge's eyebrow lifted slightly. The room fell silent again. Richard turned back to Naomi, nodding once, before addressing the bench. "Your Honor, we have a paternity verification submitted voluntarily by Mr. Martin before his death, signed under medical supervision. It confirms his intent, his acknowledgement, and his final wish." He handed the folder to the clerk. Naomi's breath caught as she watched the judge review the papers. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. Finally, the judge looked up. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice neither soft nor severe, but level. "Do you wish to make a statement before I proceed?" Naomi hesitated. The courtroom seemed to close in around her. The rustle of suits, the tap of pens, the weight of every eye. Richard gave her a small nod, his gaze steady, anchoring her to the moment. She rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the bench. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but sure. "I didn't come here for money," she began, And I didn't come here for power. I came because my child deserves to know where they came from and who their father was. She looked toward Charles, then down at the papers on the table. Glenn Martin wasn't just a name on a company building. He was a man who spent his last breath trying to do one thing right. And I won't let that be forgotten, because it's inconvenient. A hush swept through the courtroom. Naomi's eyes glistened, but she didn't falter. He told me once that people remember what you give, not what you own. This child is what he gave the world a chance for something new, something better. That's all I'm fighting for. For a moment, no one moved. Even the judge's pen paused midair. Then finally, she nodded, the faintest hint of warmth in her eyes. "Thank you, Ms. Carter," she said. When the ruling came, it felt less like a verdict and more like a tide shifting. The judge's voice was calm, decisive. This court recognizes the unborn child carried by Naomi Carter as the biological and legal heir of Glenn Martin. The private trust established under his signed intent shall be honored in full. The challenge is dismissed. A breath Naomi hadn't realized she'd been holding escaped her lips. The room erupted into a flurry of motion protests from the board's lawyers, mutters from the Martins, but it all faded into background noise. Richard placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he murmured. "You did it." She turned to him, tears streaming freely now, and for the first time in months, she let herself cry without restraint. "No," she whispered through trembling lips. "We did." Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was crisp, bright, the kind of day Glenn would have said belonged to beginnings, not endings. Cameras flashed at the courthouse steps, voices called out questions, but Richard shielded her with his coat, guiding her through the crowd. When they reached the car, Naomi looked back at the towering building, the place where she had faced the world that had called her less than she was, and won. Not with anger, not with manipulation, but with truth. As they drove away, she rested her head against the window, watching the city blur past. The weight in her chest was still there, but it felt different now, heavier with purpose rather than pain. Richard glanced at her from the driver's seat. "You know, you reminded me of him in there," he said quietly. "That fire, that conviction, he would have been proud." Naomi smiled faintly. "He's the reason I found my voice." He nodded, eyes still on the road. "Then I'd say his legacy's already begun." That night, back in her apartment, Naomi stood by the window with the letter Glenn had written her unfolded once more in her hands. The city shimmered outside, alive and untamed. She read the last line again, tracing his words with her fingertips. "Tell our child I was proud before I ever met them." Her hand drifted to her belly, the smallest of movements yet infinite in meaning. "He knows," she whispered. "We both do." Behind her, the quiet knock at the door didn't startle her. She knew who it was before she opened it. Richard stood there, coat damp from the rain, eyes warm beneath the soft hallway light. "I thought you might need company tonight," he said simply. For the first time, Naomi didn't say no. She stepped aside, letting him in. The door closed softly behind them, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. Two souls, one carrying a future, the other guarding its past, sat together in silence, bound not by obligation, but by the fragile, beautiful thing Glenn had left behind. Spring came late that year, as if the city itself needed time to thaw after so much grief. The snow that had once mirrored her loneliness melted into soft puddles along the streets, and the air smelled faintly of rain and possibility. Naomi Carter stood on the small balcony of her new apartment in Lincoln Park, sunlight brushing her face. The city stretched before her, alive, unpredictable, full of the kind of noise she used to find overwhelming. Now, it comforted her. It reminded her that life continued, even when you weren't ready for it. It had been 3 months since the court's decision. The Martin family had withdrawn from the spotlight, too wounded in pride to pursue another legal war. Naomi's name still floated across headlines and social feeds, half pity, half scandal, the maid who carried the air. But the noise faded faster than she expected. The world moved on. She didn't. The mornings were quieter now. She would wake to the slow flutter of movement inside her, the steady rhythm that reminded her she was no longer alone. Some days she spoke aloud to the child, her voice soft as she folded laundry or watered the plants Richard had brought her. "You're stronger than you think, little one," she would whisper. "You come from fire." Richard visited often, though he always gave her the illusion of choice. He never arrived unannounced. He never stayed too long. Sometimes he came with legal papers, other times with takeout from her favorite Creole restaurant near the river. He never asked about Glenn unless she mentioned him first. When she did, his responses carried a balance of respect and quiet honesty that made her feel safe. One afternoon, Naomi sat on the worn couch, a notebook open on her lap. She had started writing letters to the child, memories of Glenn, the small, luminous details that grief tends to blur with time. She wanted her son or daughter to know not just who their father was, but why he had changed. There was a knock at the door. Richard's voice came from the other side, warm and measured. "It's me." "Come in," she called, smiling faintly. He stepped inside, his hair damp from the drizzle outside. "You look better," he said, setting down a small grocery bag on the table. "Color in your cheeks again." "That's a good sign. I feel lighter," she admitted, "though I think the baby's getting heavier by the day." He smiled. "That's how it works. One life makes room for another." She glanced at the window, where the first streaks of sunlight broke through gray clouds. "Sometimes I think he can see us," she said quietly, "like he's watching to make sure I'm doing this right." Richard's gaze softened. He'd have trusted no one else. "Believe me." There was a silence comfortable, like two people sharing the same unspoken memory. Then she gestured toward the grocery bag. "What's that?" He pulled out a stack of envelopes, a few books, and a small wooden box. These came from Glenn's storage. "Personal items. I thought you might want to go through them." Her fingers brushed the box, the grains smooth beneath her touch. "You sure I'm ready for this?" Only one way to know. She hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were photographs, a few old watches, and a single thumb drive labeled Legacy. At the bottom lay a picture of Glenn she'd never seen before. Young, smiling beside a woman with soft auburn hair, and a child who couldn't have been more than 6. Her breath caught. "Who are they?" Richard looked at the photo, his expression tightening. "That's his sister, and the boy, his nephew Ethan. They both died in a car accident 12 years ago. He never spoke about it much." Naomi traced the boy's face gently with her thumb. He carried that loss with him. "It changed him," Richard said. "That was when he built the first firewall for cybertech, the one meant to protect people from losing what they love." He was talking about more than data, Naomi. He was talking about himself. Her eyes filled with tears. He spent his life trying to build something that could stop pain. And in the end, Richard murmured, he found someone who reminded him it was okay to feel it. She closed the box carefully, her hands trembling. The baby shifted inside her, a small flutter that made her gasp softly. Richard noticed and smiled. "He's saying hello." "Or complaining that I'm crying again," she said with a watery laugh. That evening, Richard stayed to help her make dinner. They worked quietly. He chopped vegetables while she stirred a pot of soup. The domestic rhythm felt strange, almost dangerous in its comfort. When he reached past her to grab a knife, his sleeve brushed her arm, and the brief contact sent a current through her. She caught herself holding her breath. "Sorry," he murmured. "It's fine," she said too quickly, turning back to the stove. But it wasn't fine. It was different. She had spent months surrounded by absence, and now here was presence, solid, kind human. And it scared her because it made her realize how lonely she still was. After dinner, they sat by the window, coffee mugs warming their hands as the city lights came alive outside. Richard leaned back, studying her with that quiet attentiveness she had come to rely on. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Next, I'm still learning how to breathe again." "That's fair," he said. "But someday you'll have to decide where to plant roots. This city can be cruel, but it's also forgiving, if you know where to look." Naomi sipped her coffee. "I don't know if I belong anywhere yet." He turned his head slightly, his voice low. "Maybe belonging isn't about place. Maybe it's about who stands beside you when you stop running." She looked at him, then really looked, and saw something in his eyes she hadn't before. Not pity, not duty, just quiet affection wrapped in restraint. The kind that didn't demand, only waited. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm still here." The words lingered between them, gentle but powerful, like a promise made in the language of silence. Weeks passed. Naomi's belly grew round, her movements slower. Richard kept his distance when she needed space. Yet somehow he was always there, driving her to doctor's appointments, fixing the leaky faucet, making sure she never felt forgotten. His presence became as steady as the pulse beneath her skin. One night, unable to sleep, Naomi found herself standing by the balcony again. The city glittered beneath her, the lake stretching out like dark glass. Behind her, the soft knock came. She didn't turn. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said. "You didn't." Richard replied. His voice was warm, close. "Couldn't sleep either." They stood side by side, the night wind lifting her hair. "I keep thinking about the future," she murmured, "about raising a child who'll never meet his father." "He'll know him," Richard said. "Through you. Through the way you speak his name. Through the way you love." Naomi's throat tightened. "And what about you, Richard? Why are you still here?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Because I promised a dying man I'd protect you. And somewhere along the way, that stopped feeling like a promise." Her breath caught. She turned to face him. His expression was steady, open, vulnerable. The kind of look that said he'd been waiting for her to see him, not as Glenn's friend, not as her protector, but as a man quietly falling in love. Naomi's heart pounded. "Richard?" He smiled faintly. "Don't say anything. Not now. Just know that you're not alone." For the first time, she didn't look away. The air between them trembled with everything unsaid. Then gently she reached out and placed his hand against her stomach. "She's kicking," she whispered. Richard froze, then smiled as he felt the faint thrum of life beneath his palm. "She's strong. She's his," Naomi said. Then after a pause, her eyes met his. "But maybe she's mine too. Ours, in a way that means continuing, not replacing." He nodded, his voice breaking slightly. That's what Glenn wanted. A future that wasn't haunted, but inherited. In that moment, under the soft hum of city lights and spring wind, something shifted. The past didn't vanish. It simply took its rightful place behind them, leaving room for something new. Naomi didn't know what love would look like again, or if she was ready to find out. But as she stood there, Richard's hand still resting gently on her belly, she realized This was how redemption felt, not grand or sudden, but quiet and human. A second chance. A legacy still unfolding. Summer arrived in Chicago with its heavy warmth and the scent of magnolia drifting through the open windows. The city pulsed with life. Markets crowded, jazz spilling from corner bars, lovers walking hand in hand along the lakefront. For most people, it was just another season. But for Naomi Carter, every sunrise now carried a quiet countdown. Her due date was close. The nights had grown restless sleep, a fragile thing she couldn't hold on to. Sometimes she dreamed of Glenn, his voice echoing in fragments. His touch, a memory she could still feel. Other times she woke with her hand pressed to her belly, whispering to the life inside her, reminding both of them that everything she was doing, every breath, was for tomorrow. Richard had become part of that tomorrow, in ways she hadn't expected. He was there without demanding to be an unspoken constant. Some mornings he brought breakfast before heading to court. Other nights he stayed late reviewing papers while she rested. Their conversations shifted between the practical and the profound, baby names, parenting books, estate management, and the strange balance of grief and renewal. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense. It was something steadier, something that grew in the spaces between heartbreak and hope. But peace, Naomi had learned, was never permanent. It started with a letter, a sleek white envelope with the Martin family crest pressed in gold. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked beneath her apartment door. She hesitated before opening it, a knot forming in her stomach. Inside was a formal notice from the family's new legal team. They were contesting the will again. This time, not for control of Glenn's assets, but for custody of the child she hadn't even brought into the world yet. Her vision blurred as she read the words. Unfit mother, potential exploitation, request for paternity review and guardianship transfer. Each phrase struck like a blade. She sank into the couch, the paper trembling in her hands. It didn't matter that the court had already ruled, or that Glenn's intent was clear. The Martins had money power and a deep generational pride that refused to allow a woman like her, black working class, an outsider, to raise one of their own. When Richard arrived later that afternoon, he found her sitting in silence, the letter open on the table. His eyes darkened as he read it. "They don't learn, do they?" he muttered. Naomi's voice was low. "They're going to take my baby." He knelt beside her, steady and calm. "No, they won't. Not while I'm here." She shook her head, tears spilling over. "They have the money. They have the lawyers. I'm just—" "Don't finish that sentence," he interrupted gently, his hand firm over hers. "You're not just anything. You're the mother of Glenn Martin's child. You fought them once and won. You'll do it again." Her eyes lifted to his, desperate and searching. "I can't go through that again, Richard. I don't have the strength." He squeezed her hand, his voice soft but unyielding. "Then I'll be your strength until you find it again." For the first time, she didn't argue. The next few weeks blurred into preparation. Court filings, interviews, background checks. Richard handled most of it, but Naomi was forced to relive every detail of her relationship with Glenn, every action dissected under suspicion. The Martins' lawyers painted her as a manipulator who had preyed on a dying man's guilt. Their words cut deep, but Naomi refused to crumble. Not this time. Still, the nights were hardest. She would lie awake, one hand over her belly, the other holding Glenn's old letter. "They won't take you," she whispered to her unborn child. "I swear it." When the hearing finally came, the city was caught in the heat of July. The courthouse felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Naomi wore a simple white dress, no jewelry, no excess, just quiet dignity. Richard stood beside her, his hand occasionally brushing hers under the table, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. Charles Martin sat across the aisle, his expression unreadable. He had aged in the months since Glenn's death, but his arrogance remained intact. His attorney spoke with cold precision, detailing every reason Naomi was unsuitable: her lack of education, her modest income, her emotional instability following the deceased's passing. When it was Naomi's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She stood slowly, every step deliberate, her belly full and heavy beneath the thin fabric of her dress. For a moment she didn't speak. She simply looked at the judge, then at the faces that had come to doubt her humanity. "I'm not here to fight for money," she began softly, "and I'm not here to fight for pride. I'm here because this child," she placed a hand over her stomach, "isn't a scandal or a mistake. He's a promise, one Glenn made to himself before he left this world." Her voice trembled, but she kept going. He wanted something good to come from a life that had been defined by fear and control. "And I'm not perfect, but I loved him, not for what he owned, not for what he gave me, but for who he became when he stopped being afraid. That's what I'll teach his son, not power, not privilege, but grace." There was a stillness that followed the kind that changed things. Even the judge seemed to hesitate before looking down at her papers again. When the verdict came, it was simple and final. Naomi retained full guardianship. The Martins' petition was denied. Relief flooded through her so suddenly she couldn't breathe. Richard's hand found hers again, and she leaned into him, trembling. The Martins stormed out without another word, but it didn't matter. The war was over, or so she thought. Later that evening, as they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. Flashes went off, voices shouting questions. "Naomi, how does it feel to win again? Do you think Glenn's family will appeal? Who will raise the Martin heir?" Richard shielded her, guiding her through the noise until they reached the car. She slid into the passenger seat, heart still pounding. Once they pulled onto the quiet stretch of Lakeshore Drive, Naomi exhaled, tears spilling freely now. "It's really over." Richard smiled faintly, glancing at her. "It's over." She let out a shaky laugh. "Then why do I still feel like I'm waiting for something?" "Because peace," he said softly, "never feels real after you've fought this hard for it." That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. The adrenaline still hummed through her body. Around midnight, she walked out to the small balcony, the city lights glowing beneath a sky full of stars. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and she pressed her hand against her belly, whispering, "We did it, little one. You're safe." Behind her, the door creaked open. Richard stepped out barefoot, a cup of tea in his hand. "I thought you might be awake." She smiled faintly. "I think he likes to dance at midnight." He joined her at the railing, the two of them standing side by side. "You know," he said quietly, "you've changed this city in a way Glenn never could." She turned to him, surprised. "How?" "By showing it that love doesn't have to be written in contracts or carved into stone," he said. "Sometimes it just lives in the quiet defiance of a woman who refused to let power define her worth." Her eyes softened, the wind lifting her curls. "You always know what to say, don't you?" he smiled. "Only when it's true." For a moment they stood there in silence, the distance between them thinning with every breath. Naomi turned her face toward him, the city reflected in her eyes. And for the first time since Glenn's death, she didn't feel like she was betraying him by letting someone else see her heart. When Richard reached out, it wasn't to claim her, it was to steady her. His hand brushed her cheek, his touch, feather light, reverent. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he whispered. "I know," she said, her voice trembling, "but I think I needed to be to understand what I wanted." "And what's that?" Naomi looked up at him, her smile small, but certain. To live, to love without fear again. The city lights shimmered behind them, the hum of traffic a distant lullaby. For the first time, the weight she carried of grief, of legacy, of expectation, felt less like a burden and more like a gift. Glenn's memory wasn't fading. It was transforming. Through her, through Richard, through the child who would soon take his first breath. When Richard finally drew her into his arms, it wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something Glenn himself had started. A circle closing a promise kept. The autumn wind carried the faint scent of rain through the quiet neighborhood in Evanston just north of Chicago where Naomi had built her new life. The trees along the street had turned to gold and rust, and baby Ethan's laughter filled the air as he toddled across the small backyard, chasing after the last butterflies of the season. Naomi watched from the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her heart full and quiet. For the first time in years, peace didn't feel like a temporary guest. It felt earned. Richard's voice drifted from inside the house. "He's going to outgrow that jacket in a week," he said, stepping out with a stack of folders tucked under his arm, smiling in that effortless way that always calmed her. He had aged softly with laugh lines deepening at the corners of his eyes, and a steadiness that only came from years of carrying both loss and gratitude. Naomi looked up at him and smiled. "He'll outgrow everything if he keeps running like that." Richard leaned against the porch railing beside her. "You said you wanted a boy with his father's spirit," he teased. "Seems you got exactly that." She didn't answer, just watched her son with a look that said more than words ever could. Glenn's legacy lived in the child, the same determined frown, the same unyielding curiosity. But where Glenn had been hardened by loneliness, little Ethan carried light in everything he did. That was her promise to give him what Glenn had never had. They lived simply now. The courtroom battles were behind them, the Martins had retreated into silence, and the city that once whispered about the billionaire's Maid had moved on to newer scandals. Naomi worked part-time as a caregiver at a local clinic, her heart drawn back to helping people, while Richard had shifted his legal practice toward social advocacy. Together they found meaning in rebuilding, not replacing. But even peace has echoes. And sometimes those echoes come as a knock on the door. It happened one quiet Tuesday afternoon. Naomi was folding baby clothes when she heard it, 3 slow knocks, deliberate and calm. She opened the door to find a man in his late 50s, his face lined with weariness and guilt. He wore a dark overcoat, his hair silver at the temples, and in his hand he held a small leather folder. "Mrs. Carter," he asked gently. "My name is Alan Rhodes. I was Glenn Martin's personal legal advisor years ago, before everything changed." Naomi hesitated. The name tugged at something familiar, a shadow from Glenn's past. "You were his attorney." "Yes," he said, "but more than that, I was his friend. And I'm here because there's something you need to see. Something he wanted you to have, though. I was too much of a coward to deliver it until now." She stepped aside, her heartbeat quickening. "Come in." Inside, the air was still, the clock ticking softly in the background. Richard joined them, instinctively reading the tension. Alan placed the folder on the table, his hands trembling slightly. "Glenn left these with me months before his death," he said. "He said if you ever found peace, if you ever started to live again, this should reach you, because it might change the way you see him." Naomi exchanged a wary glance with Richard before opening the folder. Inside were several handwritten letters. The paper yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but unmistakably Glenn's. Beneath them was a photograph, grainy old, of Glenn with a young woman Naomi didn't recognize. She was fair-haired, smiling shyly, and visibly pregnant. Naomi's chest tightened. Who is she? Alan's expression softened. Her name was Elise Warren. She worked for one of Glenn's partner companies nearly a decade ago. They were close. She lost the baby in the 7th month. Glenn never recovered from it. He blamed himself for everything. The stress, the distance, the arguments. It was his first real loss, and it changed him. Naomi stared at the photograph, her breath unsteady. It wasn't jealousy that burned. It was sorrow. A sorrow that Glenn had carried this alone, never speaking of it, never letting anyone see how deep his guilt ran. Richard spoke quietly. He never told me either. Alan nodded. He rarely did. But after her death, he started pouring himself into work, into control. That's when he built Martin Cybertech into what it became. Success was his apology to the world. But he never forgave himself. Until perhaps he met you. Naomi ran her fingers over the edges of the photo, feeling the weight of it, this invisible wound that had shaped the man she loved. He was never cold, she whispered. He was scared. Alan smiled sadly. Yes, and you gave him something no one else could piece. She read the first letter, her eyes tracing every curve of his familiar handwriting. If this ever reaches you, it means you've continued living. That alone means I succeeded at something. I used to think legacy was about what we build, but now I know it's about who we leave behind. I don't deserve forgiveness, Naomi, but if love counts for anything, then know that you were the first person who ever saw me. Not the empire, not the mistakes, me. Her vision blurred with tears. She folded the letter back gently, pressing it to her chest. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking, for bringing this. Alan stood, his expression weary, but relieved. He wanted you to know he loved you, in his own way, and that the past shouldn't haunt you, it should free you. When he left, silence filled the room again. Richard reached across the table, covering her hand with his. You okay? She nodded slowly. It hurts, she said, but it's a good kind of hurt. It makes everything make sense. Over the next few days, Naomi read the rest of the letters in fragments late at night while Ethan slept. They were confessions, apologies, reflections, a map of a man's redemption drawn in ink and regret. Each letter peeled back a layer of the Glenn she had known, the visionary, the broken son, the man who had wanted one last chance to create something good. One night, as the wind howled outside, she turned to Richard after reading the final letter. He never stopped carrying it. The guilt, the love, all of it. Richard looked up from his book, his tone gentle. And you didn't erase it. You transformed it. She smiled faintly, the flicker of the fire casting light across her face. Do you ever wonder, she asked, if he somehow knew that I'd find you, that you'd help finish what he started? Richard leaned back, thoughtful. Maybe. Glenn was always 10 steps ahead. But I think what he really wanted was for you to live, to have a life bigger than the pain he left behind. The following week, Naomi received another unexpected visit. This time, it was from Margaret Martin, Glenn's aunt, a woman whose sharp eyes and elegant poise had once made Naomi feel small in every room. But now, as the older woman stood on the porch, there was something different about her. I owe you an apology, Margaret said, the moment Naomi opened the door. Not for the legal wars. Those were business. But for how I saw you. I thought you were just a story, a girl who wanted something she didn't earn. I was wrong. Naomi hesitated. Mrs. Martin, Margaret, the woman corrected softly. She reached into her handbag and produced a small velvet box. He bought this a week before the surgery. He asked me to hold it. I didn't know why, but I think now I do. Naomi opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a sapphire pendant, the same deep blue as Glenn's eyes. On the inside of the box lid were engraved words, "A future worth choosing." For a moment, Naomi couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, her fingers trembling. He planned everything, she whispered. Margaret nodded, her own eyes glistening. He believed in you. That's all that matters. After the older woman left, Naomi sat by the window, turning the pendant over in her palm. It caught the afternoon light, glowing like a captured memory. Richard found her there a while later, silent and still. "She brought this?" he asked. Naomi nodded, smiling through tears. "It feels like he's still here, guiding me." Richard knelt beside her, gently fastening the necklace around her neck. "You don't need it to remember him," he said softly. "But maybe you can wear it to remind yourself that love doesn't end. It changes form." She looked at him, the warmth of his hands steadying her. "You always know how to make grief sound like grace," he smiled. "That's because you taught me how." That night, Naomi sat on the porch, the pendant glinting faintly under the moonlight. She thought of Glenn, of the woman in the photo, of the letters that had rewritten his story, not as a tragedy, but as redemption. And for the first time, she didn't feel haunted by the past. She felt held by it. Inside baby, Ethan stirred in his crib, murmuring softly in his sleep. Naomi rose and walked to him, brushing her fingers gently over his cheek. "You'll never know the weight your father carried," she whispered, "but you'll know the love that came from it." Behind her, Richard appeared in the doorway, his voice low and certain. "He'd be proud of you, Naomi." She turned, her eyes shining. "Of us," she said. Winter settled softly over Chicago, wrapping the world in white quiet. From the window of her home near the lake, Naomi watched the snow fall in slow spirals, like time itself had chosen to move gently for once. The house glowed with warmth, the soft hum of the heater, the golden flicker of candles, the faint laughter of a little boy, building towers from wooden blocks in the living room. Ethan James Martin was almost 2 now, curious and unstoppable, his dark curls and determined frown, a perfect blend of 2 lives that had once collided through pain and choice. Naomi sat by the window, her hands around a mug of cocoa, the sapphire pendant glinting at her throat. It had become more than jewelry. It was a compass, a reminder of how far she had come and how loss, when faced with love, could bloom into something lasting. Behind her, Richard was setting the table, 2 plates, a small vase of winter roses, and a single candle. "You know," he said with a quiet smile, "I still can't believe he sleeps through dinner now. Feels like yesterday he was waking up every 2 hours demanding attention." Naomi laughed softly, turning toward him. "He still demands it. He just waits until sunrise now." Richard chuckled, pulling out her chair. "Then we should enjoy this peace while it lasts." They ate slowly, the way people do when they have learned not to rush through life. Conversation drifted easily from court updates to neighborhood gossip, to the story Richard had promised to tell Ethan one day about his father. There was no bitterness in the way they spoke of Glenn now, no ache, just reverence, quiet and true. After dinner, Naomi wandered into the nursery. The moonlight poured through the curtains, falling across the crib where Ethan slept, curled around his stuffed bear. She brushed a hand over his soft curls and whispered, "You're everything he hoped for." Her voice caught slightly, but not in grief, more in awe. Because somewhere between heartbreak and healing, she had stopped surviving and started living again. When she returned to the living room, Richard was by the fire, a small velvet box in his hands. Her heart skipped recognizing the same box Glenn's aunt had once given her, its edges worn with time. "You kept it," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes steady and full of quiet meaning. "I kept it because I didn't want it to just be a memory. I wanted it to become a promise." He opened the box. Inside was not the pendant. It was a ring, simple and elegant, a band of gold with a faint sapphire set in the center. Naomi froze her breath, catching in her throat. Richard took a slow breath. "I know you've lived through storms I can only imagine, and I know you loved a man I respected deeply, but I also know this love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It changes shape, it expands, it teaches us how to love again." Naomi Carter. "I don't want to replace what you had. I just want to build what comes next with you and with him." The room felt still, like even the fire had paused to listen. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, not the kind that burned, but the kind that healed. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You waited until I could say yes for the right reasons, didn't you?" He smiled. "You once told me you needed to feel love in your bones, not just your heart. I figured I'd wait for both." She let out a soft laugh through her tears. "Then yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, something inside her settled. Not excitement, not even surprise, just peace. A sense of home that had nothing to do with walls or roofs or wealth. It was the kind of peace that could only come after surviving everything that tried to break you. They married in early spring in the small backyard where Naomi had once watched her son chase butterflies. The magnolia tree had bloomed again, its petals soft and white, like fragments of new beginnings. The ceremony was simple. No photographers, no grand audience, just family, a few close friends, and the quiet music of the wind moving through the branches. Naomi's gown was cream light, and flowing her curls, loose, the sapphire pendant resting above her heart. As she walked down the short aisle, Richard turned toward her eyes, shining with a look that said everything words could not. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, and the world around them faded into stillness. "I used to think love was about finding someone who could protect me from pain," Naomi said in her vows, her voice steady. "But now I know it's about finding someone who will walk beside you through it. Glenn gave me the courage to begin again, and you, Richard, gave me the peace to stay." Richard's hand trembled slightly as he read his own vows. "You taught me that redemption doesn't come from fixing the past. It comes from building a future worthy of it. You've shown me grace I didn't know I needed, and I promise, for as long as I'm here, you'll never have to walk through anything alone." When they kissed, it wasn't a beginning or an ending. It was a continuation of a promise made years ago in another time by another man who had believed in legacy, love, and second chances. After the guests left the house, glowed with the soft light of candles and laughter. Ethan had fallen asleep in his grandmother's arms, clutching his toy airplane. Naomi and Richard stood outside beneath the magnolia tree, the petals falling like blessings around them. "He's smiling somewhere, you know," Richard murmured. Naomi nodded, her eyes glistening. "He is, and he's at peace now." They stood in silence for a while, the air thick with gratitude. Naomi reached for Richard's hand, intertwining their fingers. "You once said, love doesn't vanish. It changes shape," she whispered. "I think I finally understand. Glenn's love didn't leave me. It led me here." Richard pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then maybe legacy isn't about what we leave behind," he said. "Maybe it's about who keeps carrying us forward." Months passed, and life unfolded in quiet beauty. Naomi opened a small writing studio in the neighborhood, helping women share their stories, stories of loss, survival, and grace. She called it the Magnolia Room, a tribute to the tree that had stood witness to every chapter of her life. Richard split his time between the city and home, turning his legal expertise toward causes that mattered justice for those who, like Naomi, once had been told they didn't belong. One bright afternoon, they sat on a park bench overlooking Lake Michigan, the water stretching endlessly into the horizon. Ethan ran ahead, his laughter echoing through the crisp air. Naomi leaned against Richard's shoulder, her heart full. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked softly. "Every day," Richard said. "Not with sadness anymore, though. More like gratitude. Without him, none of this would exist." She smiled faintly, her eyes following her son. "He used to say he wanted to leave something alive behind. I think he did." Richard looked at her, his voice warm. "You and Ethan, you're the proof that even the most broken stories can end beautifully." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and spring. Naomi closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. For so long, she had thought love was something fragile, something that shattered when touched by loss. Now she knew the truth. Love was what survived. Love was what rebuilt. As the sun dipped low, Ethan ran back toward them, his little arms reaching for his mother. Naomi lifted him easily, kissing the top of his head. "See that," she whispered, pointing at the horizon. "That's where stories begin again." Richard wrapped his arm around them both, the three of them framed by the fading light. In that moment, everything, the pain, the trials, the years of uncertainty, felt worth it. Glenn's legacy had not ended in death. It had blossomed into life, through love, through courage, through the simple act of continuing. When night fell, Naomi sat by the window one last time, watching the stars glitter above the sleeping city. She thought of all that had been lost, and all that had been found, and whispered softly into the stillness. "Thank you, Glenn, for everything. I finally understand what you meant by legacy." And somewhere beyond the quiet sky, in the unseen spaces between memory and eternity, it felt like someone was listening. If you believe in love, that heals in second chances, and in stories that bloom after the storm, don't let them fade. Share them. Speak them. Because somewhere, someone is still waiting to remember that even the deepest pain can become a promise of light.